Hey everyone. This week I turned 60. And I thought at 60, it's been 6 decades on this planet. And instead of throwing a party to celebrate how I'm not getting older, pretending that everything's peachy keen, I decided to do something a bit different. And that is to spend a week reflecting and deeply reflecting on some of the moments that have shaped who I've become. And what I discovered has definitely surprised me in these reflections, and not just the memory part in themselves, but the patterns that connect them and the threads that run through these decades of choices, of mistakes, of pivots, and of growth for sure. If you like this topic, remember you can subscribe, like, comment, and share. Let's dive in. And here's what I realized. That most of us rush through these milestones. We go from milestone to milestone, and we might have those celebratory parties and that sort of thing, but how often do we really stop and reflect on, what's happened? What have I actually learned? What wisdom have I earned that maybe I'm not yet sharing with others? So today, I'm going to get vulnerable with you, and I want to share 5 moments of my journey so far. I've got much more to go in this journey of this life, but the journey so far, some are proud moments, some are painful moments, and they're all transformative in their own light for sure. And because I believe that, when we share this way, we share our real stories, not the highly curated stories that we often see on social media. We give others permission to examine their own selves, their own stories, their own journeys. So if you're in midlife and you're questioning your path, if you feel like you're maybe sleepwalking through parts of your life, I want you to know this is for you. Let's start with the moment that changed everything, though I didn't know that at the time. So I was 22, working in retail in a lower level management position. The money was okay, and for my age anyway, and I guess I could have been climbing up that corporate ladder and sort of doing the things that are expected. You get a job and you try to, go up and evolve within that context. But then I took 3 weeks off to do a course actually to complete my degree. And this was an amazing exploration it was a cross-cultural anthropology course looking at health and healing traditions around the world. It blew my mind. So for 3 weeks, I was there in the classroom. I had, my mind was literally on fire, exploring and reading till the late hours of the night, and then discussing these ideas and being part of this intellectual stimulation that had been dormant for a number of years. It was suddenly alive again. And when that was all over and I walked back into the store where I was working, everything looked so incredibly different. The fluorescent light seemed harsher. The endless inventory and moving of stock from here to there, all this meaningless kind of make busy work that we did in retail, the whole routine felt like a prison. And I certainly didn't want to stay there. The manager of the store happened to walk by and she noticed that something was going on with me. And she said, point blank, "What's wrong?" And I said to her, "I can't do this anymore." And I don't know where that came from. It just came out of me. "I can't do this anymore." And she said, "Well, when do you want to leave?" And I looked up at the clock. And that was that. So I left. And this became one of the most important moments in my life, to be quite honest. It wasn't that I was scared, and it wasn't a practical or logical thing, me making this decision. Because I'd pretty much played most things safe in my life, this was a little bit of an upheaval even for me. There was some deeper part of myself that kind of knew that I had to do this. And it was a part of me that had never spoken before. I had no plan. I had no savings. I had no backup. But that voice inside of me said, it was like it knew, like if I didn't act right now, I would likely spend, I don't know, the next decade or longer in excuse mode about why I couldn't leave. So I left, I walked out. And as the universe does, I found a job in a restaurant that helped to pay the bills. Actually, I was making more money than I did in the retail environment, surprisingly. And I figured out what the next steps were going to be. So I wonder, how many of us have these inner voices, or this inner voice that's trying to get our attention right now? And that voice that knows that you've outgrown where you are. And even when the logical part of us is like, you can't take a next step. The question is not whether you have that voice. The question is really, are you listening to it? So fast forward a few decades, and I'd built a career, developed an expertise as a yoga instructor, and I was good. I was really good. Doing a lot of training, doing the deepening of the philosophical knowledge that underpins all of that stuff, the whole package. I was it. But somewhere along the line, being good wasn't good enough. I needed to be seen or present myself without compromise. I needed to be the one offering the real teachings, not the watered down stuff that everyone else was doing. Well, I became, to be honest, a bit of an elitist. And my approach was better, obviously. My training was deeper, obviously. And if students weren't ready for that real work, well, that was their problem. So you can imagine how my business suffered. You can probably guess even how it played out. So my classes stayed small. My studio struggled. And I was so attached to being right about how I taught this stuff that I forgot why I started teaching it in the first place. And then COVID hit. So you remember that pandemic? Suddenly, I'm teaching online classes 7 nights a week to whomever wants to show up for these Zoom classes. I had no reputation to protect at that point. I had no image really to maintain. It was just me, my laptop, my camera, my microphone, and people who wanted to connect during this crazy shift that we were all going through and these dark times that we were experiencing. And it was through that something really shifted. So instead of being the performing expert teacher, I started sharing genuinely through my love of this practice. I got super creative. I played with all sorts of themes, and I even laughed when the technology failed and things weren't going well. Imagine that. It brought me more joy than I had in teaching for many, many years, maybe ever. And the irony of all that, well, these online classes became the foundation for everything I now do as a coach. They were a teaching for me. When I stopped trying to be impressive and started being more authentic, that's when I think the real impact began for a broader swath of students anyway. So here's the thing. We all wear masks, whether it's the successful businessman, the perfect father, the guy who's got it all figured out. Sometimes these masks serve us well, but sometimes they become prisons. And we're afraid to leave these prisons because we've forgotten who we are without them. We've lost a sense of our true identity or our bigger identity. So here's the question I've learned to ask myself more regularly. Am I performing right now, or am I being? The difference between these two might just change everything. You know, we think wisdom comes from gurus and best-selling books. Sometimes it does, but it also comes from a grandmother in a wheelchair who never says a harsh thing about anyone or anything. That's a teacher. My grandmother lived with MS for most of my childhood. I can only vaguely remember times when she could walk with crutches, but mostly it was wheelchair. And then she was in a care facility for the last number of years in her life because her mobility was so impeded by this disease. And these were simple farm people. They led a very quiet life. There was really not much excitement there. But in all those years, from when I was a kid until when we lost her, I never once saw her angry. I never heard her complain about her situation, ever. Never did she speak badly of anyone, to my knowledge, not once. At that time, as a young man, I didn't get it. Like, I kind of looked at her, I guess in retrospect, in awe, but I was busy complaining about everything, my unfair bosses, my difficult situations, my struggles with money, why things weren't going my way, the classic victim mode, if I'm being entirely honest. But even now, just thinking about my grandma brings this calm over me. She taught me something that I couldn't see at the time, but she taught me grace. That grace isn't about having an easy life. It's about how we show up for that life. It's about how we meet the consequences that we find ourselves in. Then there was another influencing teacher in my life, and he was a manager in a lower level government job that I had in my 20s. Whenever I would storm into his office with a complaint about a policy or an inefficiency, because that was me, I was that guy, he'd listen, but then he'd say, if you want to come in here and tell me what's wrong, you also need to present a viable alternative. Well, that didn't land too well the first time he said that to me. I was furious. Of course, I couldn't say anything to him, but my thought process was, you're the friggin' manager. You make twice as much as I do. You figure out this problem that I'm pointing out and fix it. But slowly, it started to make sense. I started to appreciate, maybe not in the moment, what he was teaching me, that anyone can identify problems. That's easy. The thing is, how do we actually explore solutions? How can we be creative about, what would work better? So the skill became the foundation of everything I do as a coach now, because my clients come to me with their challenges. And so we creatively get to explore, what might that look like? How could we address that? The most profound teacher I would say I had was my corporate director when I was hired into the organization that I worked for 25 years. It was an organization filled with political drama, competing agendas, where kind of toxic. Somehow she maintained an incredibly positive, generous presence. It was awesome. And I always found that working with her was something really powerful, something really positive. She always found the good in what we were doing and how we were working. And when the announcement came that she was leaving, I believe pushed out by the politics of the organization, I asked her how she stayed above all the chaos in the organization. And her answer was, I choose to see the positive in everything. Wow. That was incredible. And at the time, I kind of thought that sounded a bit naive, but now looking back at 60, I finally see the learning and the real wisdom that was shared by how she did her job and in that moment of her sharing with me. The teachers who change us most aren't the ones we necessarily expect. Sometimes they are showing up with grace under pressure. Sometimes they're pushing us to strive, to think better, to challenge us. Sometimes they're modeling what it looks like to choose light over darkness. Teachers show up in a lot of different ways. So who's been teaching you without maybe you even realizing it? All right, so I want to cover another one, and this one's going to require a little bit of courage from me to share it and maybe for you to hear it even. I grew up in a broken home. This was a small town, prairie town in the early 70s. At that point, divorce was still considered kind of scandalous. My father had been psychologically abusive to all of us, my mother in particular. And when he left, I was kind of a broken 8-year-old. I was broken in such a way that I didn't trust men, and I didn't believe that I was worthy of love. That's what that kind of an environment will create. Later, when I realized I was gay, oh, this complicated everything. So I yearned for a connection with men, but I had learned to fear and distrust them. So when I came out at 21, this was really challenging. It was hard to make a connection. There weren't apps. There wasn't the digital stuff that we have now. We actually had to talk to people back then to make a connection. And I didn't have my first real relationship, my first real love, until I was 25. And frankly, that was really beautiful. Until, as it goes, a few months later, it wasn't anymore. And we both scattered and went our ways. Over the years, I had a few other attempts at relationships, but really nothing blossomed. So I developed a story. I developed a narrative for myself that love isn't for me at this stage of my life. Love will come later, when I'm older, more established, more worthy. That was my narrative. And I believed that. I believed that through my heart. It wasn't just an intellectual thing. So I got busy. Really busy. So busy that I had two careers. One of them lasting for 25 years. The other second career was about the last 15 years or so of that 25-year career. I was constantly working to achieve. I was the hyperachiever. Now I'm understanding how detrimental that is. But at the time, I thought it was a good thing. I was constantly learning. That's a good thing. I was constantly building. That can be a good thing. And then came the dating app. So all the online digital technology around meeting and hooking up. At least I could get my physical needs met without the vulnerability and the emotional connection of a relationship. It served me, I guess, well, but it still left that bigger void or that bigger story and narrative playing a role in my life. So people would ask me sometime, how come you're single? And I would naturally get defensive. I'd look at most relationships and think, ick. I'd say, why is partnership the norm? Why are singles looked at like they're broken or defective? And I think, well, I don't want that stuff anyway. And I just became very comfortable with being alone, proud of it even. But here's what I'm learning at 60. Sometimes our someday stories are just fear wearing a very sophisticated disguise. So the truth is, I've been ready for love for years. I just convinced myself I wasn't because it felt safer to control that narrative than maybe risk vulnerability and frankly, disappointment. I'm finally ready to admit that what I've always wanted is real connection, real commitment, someone to build something beautiful with. And I'm optimistic that it will happen. Maybe your someday isn't about love as mine has been. Maybe it's that business that you'll start when conditions aren't perfect. That creative project that you'll pursue when you don't actually have any extra time, or the difficult conversation that you've been avoiding. We all have something that we're putting off, telling ourselves, we'll get to it when everything lines up just right. What if the only condition that needs to be perfect is our willingness to stop waiting? If I could sit with my 40-year-old self over a beer, not that I drink much beer, but over a beer, a sip of wine, these days it might be tea, I'd have a lot to say to my 40-year-old self. Some of it would be practical. Be more careful with money and your property. Get references for contractors, for God's sake. Don't think you can figure everything out on your own. Get over your ego, I would say lovingly. That renovation you're rushing into, slow down and have a better plan. But the deeper stuff is what really matters. And at 40, you're driving deep into that spiritual work. You're going to be spending ungodly amounts on yoga, on training, and on philosophy. And it's beautiful work, and you'll become a powerful teacher, but don't let your ego hijack that journey. You'll get so caught up in being the serious teacher that you'll forget to meet students where they are. And here's a big one. All that spiritual work you're doing, while it's valuable, it's not going to heal everything. You'll spend 20 years thinking meditation and philosophy have solved your deeper issues. And then when you hit 56, you'll start working with coaches and becoming a coach yourself and discover how much healing work remains to be done. Don't be embarrassed by this revelation, but be curious about it. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Explore other modalities. Read more widely. Learn to collaborate instead of trying to do everything on your own. When you fail, and you will, know that it's just part of the process, part of the journey, not a judgment on your worth. Please remember that. Most importantly, you're actually kind and funny. Let that part of you show more. Drop some of the intensity, laugh more, love yourself more, have fun. Take time each year to be brutally honest with a self-assessment of your life. Ask the hard questions. I know they're hard. Ask them. What's working? What isn't working? Where am I fooling myself? What needs to change? At 40, you think wisdom means having all the answers. At 60, I know it means being comfortable with questions, staying curious, trusting that life unfolds exactly as it's meant to, especially if it doesn't look like anything that you had planned. Trust. So what's the point of all this vulnerability? Why share this messy, imperfect, sometimes painful part of my journey? Well, because I believe when we tell our stories, not just the highlight reel, the actual human experience, we give others permission to examine their own lives more honestly. So if you're watching this and you're in your 40s, 50s, or beyond, and if you're questioning your path, if you're feeling stuck, wondering if it's too late to make changes, let me tell you something. It's not too late. In fact, it's never too late to listen to that inner voice, to drop the masks that no longer serve you, to learn from unexpected teachers who suddenly show up in your life, to stop waiting for someday, and to get honest about what you really want from one precious life. The best part of entering your 7th decade, you'll finally stop trying to impress people and start focusing on what actually matters: connection, service, love, and truth. It's taken 60 years to get here, but man, the view is worth it. I want to leave you with this. What milestone reflections are you avoiding? What wisdom have you earned that you're not yet sharing? What would your inner voice tell you if you finally got quiet enough to listen? I know it's scary. Your answers might surprise you. More importantly, they might guide your next chapter in ways you didn't expect. So thanks for letting me share this journey with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so go ahead and talk to me about your milestone reflections in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, of course, like, share, and subscribe. Love that. Until next time, keep listening to that inner voice. It's more than you think it is, and it knows more of you than you realize. Talk to you soon.